Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Kunafa and Shay, a podcast produced for HowlRound Theatre Commons, a free and open platform for theatre makers worldwide. Kunafa and Shay discusses and analyzes contemporary and historical Middle Eastern and North African, or MENA, and Southwest Asian and North African, or SWANA, theatre from across the region.
I'm Marina.
And I'm Nabra.
And we're your hosts.
Our name, Kunafa and Shay, invites you into the discussion in the best way we know how, with complex and delicious sweets like kunafa and perfectly warm tea, or in Arabic, shay.
Kunafa and Shay is a place to share experiences, ideas, and sometimes to engage with our differences. In each country in the MENA or SWANA world, you'll find kunafa made differently. In that way, we also lean into the diversity, complexity, and robust flavors of MENA and SWANA theater. We bring our own perspectives, research, and special guests in order to start a dialogue and encourage further learning and discussion.
Welcome to the 5th season of Kunafa and Shay, where we delve into the dynamic world of performance art across the region. We're highlighting the creative, innovative, and artistic disruption of performance artists, exploring how their art serves as a powerful medium for expression and social change. This season features interviews with performance artists who challenge norms and use their craft to further conversations about topics like identity, diaspora, homeland, and futurity.
Yalla, grab your tea. The Shay is just right.
In this episode, we are joined by two poets who express their work through performance, Fargo Tbakhi and George Abraham. We examine the medium of poetry in the context of performance art and discuss their unique collaborations and multidisciplinary projects. Fargo Nassim Tbakhi is a queer Palestinian-American performance artist and writer. He is the winner of the Ghassan Kanafani Resistance Arts Prize, a Pushcart and Best of the Net nominee, and a Taurus. He has received fellowships from Rhizome DC, Viseart, Desert Nights Rising Stars, Halcyon Arts Lab, Mosaic Theatre, and Robbie. His writing appears in Foglifter, Mizna, Peach Mag, Apex Magazine, Strange Horizons, The Shallow Ends, ProLit, and select bags of Nomadic Crowns coffee. His performance work has been programmed at Outsider Fest, Intersection Solo Fest, the Rachel Corrie Foundation's Shuruk Festival, the Alwoon House Monsters Ball, Mosaic Theatre, and has been supported by the Arizona Commission on the Arts.
George Abraham is a Palestinian-American poet. Their debut poetry collection, Birthright, published by Button Poetry in 2020, won the Arab American Book Award and was a Lambda Literary Award finalist. They are the executive editor of Mizna and co-editor of Heaven Looks Like Us, Palestinian Poetry, which will be published by Haymarket Books in 2025. They are a graduate of Northwestern's Litowitz MFA and MA program and teach at Amherst College as a writer in residence.
We are so excited to have you both here. We both saw you perform and share poetry in various conferences and things. Just had the absolute pleasure to hear some of your writing. And so we're just really thrilled that you're here, and both here together is just an honor. So thank you, Fargo and George, for joining us.
Yes, so exciting. Thank you both.
We have this, we have your bios, of course, but we'd love to get to know more about how you each define yourselves as artists more holistically.
I'm George. I'm a poet and editor and interdisciplinary artist. I think as a term that Fargo has given me that I've identified with a lot more lately. And yeah, I've also leaned into essayist and critic as kind of descriptors as of late.
Yeah, 100%. Love all of that, George. And you certainly are an interdisciplinary artist, as much as disciplines even exist. For myself, I have sort of arrived at primarily defining myself as a performance artist. And partially, even though my work often takes the form of, like George, poetry, essays, installation work, those all for me fall under this larger rubric of performance as a lens to understand the kinds of, for me, primarily relationships that I'm trying to build through the various art forms. Performance is the thing that allows me to most directly bring to the fore the idea of relationality. And so I've found myself understanding poetry as a performative way of writing, essays as a performative way of writing, and there are like specific things that emerge through performance that is intentionally live performance. But as a wider lens to understand for myself the kind of work that I make, I've opted to use performance as this kind of broader umbrella term to think about all of the work that I do.
Amazing. And you both were so succinct with your answers. I love this. And they really, I think, tease out some of the other things we want to talk about in this episode. So you've both been working on a commission of a play, Eve. When I got the email from Silk Road, no longer Silk Road Rising, Silk Road, I'm
Cultural
losing the word.
Center.
Cultural Center, thank you. Very excited for this change. So when they sent the email, I was like, this, first of all, the graphic looks amazing, like just the description. Can you tell us about that? And then we would love to hear after that any other projects you're working on. But first, let's start with Eve.
Yeah, I can give the elevator pitch, sort of. So Eve really began a few years ago when George and I, in the midst of the early stages of the pandemic, we were just getting on phone calls every week and sharing work and just talking about how we were feeling and what we were thinking about. And on one of those calls, it emerged that we were both, to various degrees, obsessed with John Milton's epic poem Paradise Lost. And the kind of cheeky beginning of it was the two of us wondering if anyone had ever written a Palestinian Paradise Lost, which is sort of the reductive entry point into what we ended up doing. So we started writing little experiments together, and then we were offered a residency at the Arab American National Museum in the fall of 2021, and we just started experimenting with what a larger project, kind of using that reductive entry point to get into something bigger, might look like. So it's been a few years of continuing development. We've gotten support from the National Performance Network as well as the MAP Fund to kind of keep expanding the project into something bigger. And it's been really exciting to follow that initial curiosity and see how it develops as we develop and as the world develops. And so in terms of what the project actually is at its core, it has ended up being a kind of deconstruction of Paradise Lost. Some of the language we've used is that we've kind of broken Paradise Lost into a bunch of little pieces and taken the pieces that we're interested in and kind of repurposed them into um, a, a way to meditate on or explore questions of failure and loss within the context of anti-imperial revolution and what it feels like to be um, to have lost inside of that context and to then continue going to keep attempting what you already failed at. So in some ways, like it begins with finding some of this texture inside the language of Paradise Lost and just pulling on these threads and seeing what we want to bring of ourselves into that context and where things fit or where they don't fit. One of the things we really understood early on is that we didn't want to just say, let's retell Paradise Lost, but as Palestinians, mostly because it's not very interesting. And so it became a lot stranger, and we sort of allowed ourselves to explode that initial text and bring in a lot stranger things and a lot more surreal things, as well as some sharper um, historical things. And yeah, so at this point, the last thing that happened in its development is we did a week-long workshop of the current draft of this script in Chicago with Silk Road Cultural Center. And I think that told us a lot about how the last 10 months have reshaped the piece and the different kinds of requirements we want to bring to what the project is doing. And this is all hopefully going to lead to a kind of, its official premiere sometime next year is the hope. So that's kind of the little backstory and a bit of context on what Eve is.
That's really exciting, and I have a couple follow-up questions, which is, first of all, like, how did you find out that you both are obsessed with Paradise Lost? And also, what does it mean to be obsessed with Paradise Lost is a question I have just as a human. And then, the other thing is that I've seen Eve described as a necro-pastoral, and Paradise Lost being within the pastoral genre, but if you could talk about what that is, if you have maybe coined that term, I've never heard that before. I'm interested in that, term.
No,
We can give you credit in
absolutely
this
not.
podcast if you'd like it, but I'd love to know more about what that term is or how you're really defining the piece genre-wise and structure-wise, maybe.
I guess I could answer. Yeah, I could take a stab at those questions. Maybe starting with the last one. Yeah, I guess like necropastoral is credit goes to Joyelle McSweeney, brilliant theorist and poet herself. Thinking about, I guess, like what is the kind of contemporary evolution in kind of a really messed up way of the pastoral tradition and genre within the necrotic waste landscape of modernity. And she kind of defines this within anti-colonial tradition, posing it within like Césaire, Kim Hai-soon's work as two examples. Another big touch point is the World War One poet, like anti-war poets, like Wilfred Owen, for example. And just thinking about, yeah, these are kind of the sites at which she like says, the pastoral of today or whatever actually is more of a haunted landscape of like one that operates on viscera, and the question of flesh is just very different right now because of the this sort of spiraling catastrophe that is global modernity under imperialism. And so for us, I guess it was kind of a entry point in some ways. It opened up some curiosities. And this touches on the first question of obsessed with Paradise Lost, because I think people have just long been weirdly obsessed with Milton. And I like not just obsessed in a like okay, there's like the boring academia, oh, we're gonna like devote ourselves in our entire research careers to studying this one line break in this one poem or whatever, kind of forms, but more of like after Milton's death, like years later, his body was actually exhumed and his bones were taken out of his grave and sold on like the black market of England. And so there's a kind of necrotic, like driven, like an obsession to the point of like a necrotic point with Milton that Fargo and I found this story is always increasingly fascinating every time I return to it. And another kind of like key touchstone of like unlocking thought in the project. Joyelle McSweeney was one kind of earlier touchstone, thinking about, when we think about Palestinian exile, what is that necrotic pastoral landscape of that exile and that, that loss, right? That's one kind of thought entry point, if that makes sense, for the project that we've had. But another kind of point was an amazing recent biography of Milton. Joe Moshenska's um, wrote a really, really incredible thinking about called Making Darkness Light, thinking about Milton as an embodiment of multiple selves and like this weird kind of botched embodiment of what does it mean to even like love a poet. How do we like Milton is such a weird figure life wise historically, when thinking about how we even remember or canonize poets. He was in one way prophet. He really truly thought of himself as messianic, and I thought of himself as a really, really, really rigorous, like you need a PhD in theology to understand what the hell I'm saying type figure on one hand. But then on another hand, he's so incredibly weird and mystic, and was part of a failed revolution himself on that ended in the beheading of King Charles III, but also then just years later, the British monarchy reinstated itself. Empire warped and adapted and, continued in its form and actually evolved, in its form. And so, in a way, Milton was kind of an accessory towards like getting at the heart of what we're thinking about, of like, what does it mean to keep going in the midst of an empire that is actually actively adapting and actively shaping and reforming itself and remaking itself and reinventing itself, and then thereby reproducing these catastrophes that so many of us, definitely Palestinians, definitely Ghazawi, are living and surviving and resisting miraculously, despite. So yeah, so I think that in a way, like Fargo said, there's the hashtag representation, like OMG, Paradise Lost with a falafel instead of an apple or something. I don't know, like, and like that, like silly entry point. But more of it's actually no, the real. It's really funny that you brought up McSweeney and the Necropastoral with this. The entry points actually kind of were and still are the end of Empire and what that really means, I guess. I also would say I don't know if I would call Paradise Lost a pastoral. It's an epic poem for sure, but like I mean, it has pastoral elements. I wouldn't. Yeah, I guess like it's also definitely not a like. Yeah, it's a term I wouldn't use for Paradise Lost specifically. I guess. But yeah, it's logic. The logic of the necropastoral is definitely in our thinking right now, and I think we've sort of dropped it as a subtitle because like we don't even need a subtitle. I mean, it's just Eve. It just is what it is, and um, you know, and as a source text change, etc. Yeah.
Along those lines, I've also seen it described in different locations as a play, as a poetry performance, maybe performance art piece, definitely a multidisciplinary piece in some way. Can you talk about form as well, especially since this whole season we're talking about performance art, which is such a nebulous idea, but largely because we are finding ourselves breaking down the concept of theater the more we do this theater podcast. So we were like, okay, it's time to really go all the way. So we'd love to know about this more as kind of a example, perhaps, of where performance structurally might be going and where we're seeing theater maybe looking like as it evolves into a more multidisciplinary space that's, I think, being innovated by performance artists like yourself.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, for me, I think a lot of the messiness or confusion or slipperiness between, is it a play, is it a piece of experimental theater, is it an installation, these are mostly marketing terms, like they don't really describe things in a way that's useful to people outside of telling your donors what's in the new season. So, in our approach to it, there are a couple of things that maybe like our two positions, George as primarily like a poet and a very writerly person who also has a slam poetry background, so comes to the writing from that lens of performance, and myself as someone who does a lot of like solo performance. The things that maybe become different in even approaching the question of doing something, a project like this, might be an approach to narrative that is not really there. We're not necessarily interested in following the shapes of traditional play structures. We're more interested in bringing in various kinds of voices, like the voice of a particular kind of historical document that just becomes text that people on stage read. And so in our experiments so far, as part of kind of crafting what the project is, we've done puppetry, we've done shadow puppetry, we've done sort of abstract movement pieces. And I think what that has allowed us to do is focus more on sensation, or more on a more holistic understanding of how performance communicates, rather than trying to focus on character motivation or the spine of a play. the superstructure of a play, right? We've sort of allowed ourselves to like not even consider those things. And so that also maybe leads to thinking about the sort of quote unquote characters in Paradise Lost, not as characters, but as positions that a person can take, right? And in doing that, we can kind of keep spinning out the connections that we're able to make using the text or ideas or already laid groundwork of Paradise Lost, and bring it into borrowing images or text from Jean Genet's posthumously published book Prisoner of Love, which recounts his time with the PLO in the 70s and 80s, and marry that with just like borrowing pieces of the British Mandates Defense Emergency Regulations for Palestine, which were instituted in 1945 in response to revolt, and then became the legal basis for the State of Israel's like construction in 1948. And so like the ability to access these various kinds of registers in the performance is a kind of freedom that we might not have if we had approached this and said, we are going to write a play, right? It also might have meant that we didn't ever explore performance, that we just wrote a script and then gave it to a director and then they do the rest of the work, right? But actually bringing our performance experiments into the process of constructing the project. So it gets a little bit close to devising somehow, or sometimes, right? But even that is like, can have more of a defined structure and process. And I think we've really tried to always be open to kind of radical revisions, or letting things not be text at all, which might be our instinct as writers that are kind of approaching a performance project, and instead just trying to consider the vocabulary of performance as another tool that we have in actually writing the project, so those are maybe just a few thoughts. There's not really an easy way to describe what it is yet, partially because it's still in process. We don't necessarily know what the final project will look like. I'll say that for myself, in trying in bringing like a bit more of the performance lens sometimes to our work. One of the things that I keep coming back to as an inspiration for the kind of thing this wants to be in my instinct is the work of Reza Abdo, who was an Iranian playwright and experimental theater maker in the 1990s, who made these, very unclassifiable pieces of extreme performance that were very fast paced and very disjointed. There were oftentimes a lot of, short flashes of things that were kind of woven together or not woven together. And I find his work really beautiful and meaningful in the ways that it reflects the way we live, the way one might live inside of an empire, and kind of foregrounding some of the cruelty that comes with that. So all of this, I think, is to say that uh, we're trying to let the development of this project avoid falling into a certain category, right? If it starts to feel like a play, let's do something else. If it starts to feel like a piece of devised theater, let's get very writerly all of a sudden, and I think what that is doing is just trying to stay true to the primary concerns we have with the project, right? Which is like, going back to this question of why we were so drawn to Paradise Lost in the first place. There's just, I think for both of us, there was something about the language and the way Milton writes it that communicated this profound sense of loss, in a way that many people have thought about and written about for centuries. And our question became, how can we borrow that and try and force it into as many configurations that feel true and useful to where we are right now as we can.
Yeah, and I think something about this question of like form and failure is, I don't know, it's something I've been racking my head around too. Because as a poet, coming from like, yes, I come from spoken word and slam, and like I've always loved and been interested in performance my whole life. As I was a pianist throughout all of my childhood and whatnot. And I think that like this idea, like for me, I guess, like as a poet myself, form is actually a site of play and playfulness, and it's a site of failure as well. And a space where failure can actually be generative. Like let's test, let's take an inherited form, Sasina, sonnet, etc. These kind of all having their own historical context and whatnot, and let's push it, and somehow let's push it to the point of failure, let's push it to the point of breakage, let's see what happens when we apply any kind of pressure to any kind of its constraints and whatnot. And that's something for me that my poetry has always been interested in. So kind of coming into this both, as a way of like studying performance art with Fargo, and almost, and in some ways like because of and alongside and an inspiration from Fargo. Like I love studying my friends' work, and I love studying how my friends think and make. I think that's kind of been one of my biggest joys in this process. Actually, is like learning from Fargo and learning with Fargo. But as someone who also is very like, I will always describe myself foremost as a poet. I think that it's been really fun actually seeing these spaces where poetic form, for example, can take over. Like we had like Fargo gave me a prompt in our most recent um, week long performance workshop with Silk Road Cultural Center, and was like, let's like think about the sheer totality that Eve is trying to resist in this moment in the project, and why don't we name it? And I was like, okay, so a Lisp poem, gotcha. And I'm like writing this Lisp poem, and I'm like, well, one of the things in Paradise Lost that is so intriguing is his it's so small and so simple, but like writing a poem in perfect meter, iambic pentameter, that then breaks that iambic pentameter, that like overflows. Like his lines are so incredibly enjambed, which means overflowing into the next line. Um, for this day and age, it's very rare to see such a hyper formal container in one way that consistently gets broken as much as it does. And it's one of the things that Paradise Lost, I guess, within the poetic canon or whatever, is like known for and revered for, actually, is and so in a way of itself, Paradise Lost is a like on a formal level is an overflowing. It is a like failure of form as much as it is a success of form. It is it is a text that consistently reinvents itself and like revises itself, and so kind of taking that spirit but refracting it through today's lens. And so I took that blank, heavily enjammed verse. I just tried writing as if it was a Miltonian experiment, and started with one line from Paradise Lost and just went off and wrote a whole monologue in perfect iambic pentameter. And I'm like, we don't speak like that these days. Like the writing in formal metered verse is not something as a poet that I ever do. But in the context of a performance, experimental, interdisciplinary project, I'm like, oh, this was a fun exercise in writing in an older mode that I would have never done in a poem, honestly. And so in a way, it's kind of coming full circle where like, I love being a part of the process where the performance questions actually cause new writerly questions, and then vice versa too. And the performance and the text are kind of consistently shaping each other. To me, that makes a lot more sense as a poet than the kind of inherited models of poetry within institutions that we're given. And I think I'm a better poet because of this project collaboration. And because of its non-committal to some weird like restrained imagination of what a poem is, or but instead of like what a poem could be and what a poem could offer, and also what a poem what a poem fails at, and where failure itself is maybe the point. That's something I'm also thinking about within my artistic practice, as much as I am, you know, my political orientation to the world as well. But yeah.
I love that. I mean, I love the refusal to be restrained, the refusal to be bounded by different terminology that has, has been around for whatever length of time or reason. It just sounds really exciting, and it leads me to my a question. Nabra and I, started as friends in theater and then began collaborating in different ways on the podcast, on different writings together. And yeah, it feels like such a gift to get to collaborate with a friend in different ways. And we were curious, like, what does your collaboration look like? And I mean, ours takes on different shapes in different ways for different projects. So I know it's a large question to ask too, but I was curious if you could offer us any insights.
Yeah. Um, well, I'll certainly echo what George said, which is that it is a joy, and as you said too, Marina, it's a real joy to be able to um, bring friendship into art making and vice versa, right? To think about the ways that um, that we can both contribute to one shared project and one shared experience. And I think in terms of our collaboration, I think one of the things that makes it work is that we're very different. um, and we have very different approaches to art making, I think. As you know, one small piece of evidence that we just heard in the last answer to your last question is George really likes form and I hate form. Like, and I think oftentimes the tension of those two things can produce um, pieces that neither of us could have done by ourselves, right? So, the real discovery of working together at all is finding something that I never could have made just working on my own. And primarily in my own practice, I do just work on my own, I think. And so, like, carving out the space to think together with George towards this project, and towards, like, understanding how both of our strengths and both of the places that, like, we're not as experienced in can come together and fill each other in, and catch each other when one of us falls. It's a really lovely experience. And, in terms of the concrete, practicalities of how we've collaborated on this project, when we first started and experimented with kind of creating a DIY performance first draft of this piece back in 2021. A lot of it looked like George writing something and following a particular thread, and then me wondering how we could stage it. And part of that was allowing George to not write towards performance at all, to just write what you might write as a poem, and trying to figure out how do you stage this with just the two of us and like $200 in this giant concrete room at the Arab American National Museum. And it really led to things that I wouldn't have made by myself, right? It led to, okay, I'm going to spend 4 hours making, like 50 tiny paper puppets of an atom figure that we can use for shadow puppetry with an overhead projector that we borrowed from someone. And as we've developed, I think that balance of sort of one of us writing something and then giving it to the other person to revise or to ask questions about or to riff off of has been really generative. One thing that I've noticed, I think, is that I don't really think actually that there's been much that we have, like, written together, if that makes sense. There's not a lot of sections or pieces of the project that we've sort of sat down and said, like, you write a line and then I write a line, or let's think together about where this is going to go. A lot of it has been having conversations together and kind of mapping out needs and saying, why don't you take this part and I'll take this part? And then we come back together, and sometimes from there we'll switch, right? And, like, give a written piece to the other person to edit and to kind of think about how it fits in or doesn't fit in. And I think that has clicked for us in a way that's really useful. So, as someone also who's worked in theater in various capacities, like the more proper sort of theater industry, collaboration is very fraught often, and it can look a lot of different ways. And so it's been really useful, I think, that we've had the amount of time to work on this project that we have had, because it has allowed us to not only understand what the project is, but to understand how we work on it together. And those things don't immediately come. It's not necessarily like an easy thing to figure out with someone. And so I think we've been able to take our time and to move slowly and to have periods of time where we're not working on it at all. And I think all of that has been really useful in, number one, making sure that we don't get pissed off at each other very often in the making process, that we like have a clear set of understandings of how we work together, and what needs to get done when, and when someone needs to put on more of a like a driving hat, and when someone wants to sit more in the passenger seat, and being able to like balance that has been really useful.
Yeah, in a way, it's like taught me different modes of collaborating because with slam poetry, when we're writing group pieces, that's the collaborative, thing. It is more of like, oh, you write one line, I write one line, then you write one line, and then that's how, but that's not really, yeah, it didn't feel as useful here, just with our interests and I don't know, and exploration. I think that's the whole thing too about this, that it's kind of like once we learned each other's rhythms, we learned what that meant in terms of how to explore together and with, as opposed to like, I don't know, this whole like imposing something onto the text that like is like not going to be useful for the project, if that makes sense. Like and taking a person, sometimes it's like, oh no, I have this personal interest I'm super excited about, and it's like, oh well, actually maybe this project isn't the vehicle for this, and like getting moments like that, being like, oh yeah, actually no, this is just some other thing that I'm thinking about. And but sometimes those random thoughts are actually really useful too. But it's also interesting too, I guess, thinking that like in a way this like was birthed like by the pandemic as like a kind of catastrophic mode of time that we are still obviously in and thinking about and like surviving and navigating collectively, and also failing, right, to navigate collectively, but also like genocide time of escalated genocide in Gaza. These are two really catastrophic eras that have been superimposed onto each other. And this project, in a lot of ways, like this started as like a pandemic weekly group chat, call check-in that that then we applied to residencies where we were like, oh, cool, first residents back in person at the museum after many years, and the museum isn't even open still, and navigating what it was like to be like a resident at a museum that's not open, right? For example, versus like now it's like, yeah, we are thinking about loss in a revolutionary context and how to go on. Of course, Gaza just sharpened that our lived experiences in resisting this genocide in the various spheres Fargo and I are in touch in. Of course that is going to come in, and that is going to affect how we make a play slash performance slash project that thinks about revolutionary time and how to keep going in this. I think what Fargo has called in a recent essay like the long middle, right, of our revolution slash just the cultural intifada writ large, right? um and so I think that in a way, this project's collaboration is unfortunately, but in a really meaningful way for me at least, a result of catastrophe and a result of like responding to how do we go on in catastrophe as well, and how do we support each other in catastrophe as well. A lot of poets went very, very, very solo, and we're like, I'm gonna sit and be alone in the pandemic and write my fucking novel. And some of them are out, some of them are really, really fucking good right now, And I don't know, it was just interesting being one of the poets who was not doing that. It was like, actually, it's like kind of cool how this time made me more of an impulse towards prioritizing collaborative projects like this. And like me and Noor Hindi are just finishing our Palestinian poetry anthology, Heaven Looks Like Us, which is titled after a Fargo poem. Um, and that collaboration also in a lot of ways was a like product of the pandemic, as the ongoing pandemic as well. And was our kind of like structure that kept us like, going in so many ways, and in conversation. Yeah, I don't know. So it's just also an interesting to think about. Yeah, and how individualistic, especially literary, because coming at it from a more literary like position and experience, we're so used to just an individualistic mind of creation when we know creation actually always is collective. It's about how do we think about that practice and the difficulties of what that means to engage in a collaborative process.
And speaking of, creating art in a time of catastrophe, in times of catastrophe, especially thinking what's on the forefront of our mind, of course, is the current and ongoing genocide in Palestine and in Gaza. I know that Fargo, well, both of you are doing work, including Eve, that engages with that right now. We'd love to hear about the other work that you're working on now, whether it has to do with responding to the genocide or responding to yourself within this time of catastrophe or otherwise. And especially if either of you have other collaborations that you've worked on or are working on currently.
Sure. Yeah. I guess for me, I yeah, I'm editing MISNA, a journal of Southwest Asian and North African writing. We are in our 25th anniversary right now, which is like amazing. Being like, wow, a like truly one of the only SWANA like print journals that exists in the US. Like we're able to survive for that long and have the kind of abundant community we have. That's incredible. And working for MISNA has been just a really, really, really lovely reminder of this, I don't know, like false local global binary in a way of like just as like when Eve kind of has developed a process of refracting through every community we enter, whether it's Dearborn or the museum or Chicago and Silk Road, right? There's also another kind of way of like Mizna being such a local Twin Cities like community centered space that also has this kind of global reach being distributed throughout the US and Europe and the Sawana region and stuff. Where yeah, I don't know, I've just been thinking about how it's like when shit hits the fan, Misna has such an tight like coordinated alliance of other like community spaces in the local region that are willing to just jump in and support, at any moment, and also vice versa. And especially Minneapolis as a site of, one of the biggest like racial riots in US history, and uprisings, and a site of so much revolutionary potential and so many amazing Black and Brown and Sawana communities in and of that area. So it's like really, it feels really special to be like working in that community in some way. But also, we have a platform enough to be able to respond and actually publish work directly from Gaza, and any kind of excuse we have to just funnel money into Gaza is kind of where we're at right now. Like we will publish whatever, give us an excuse to like give y'all money truly, and redistribute money from within the empire to outside the empire, and towards its victims. And so yeah, it's been a really, really hard time for Mizna, but it's been a time of also a lot of community gathering and abundance too at the same time. And um, And so I think that that's been really taking over a lot of my work as of late. I mean, I am working on my own like creative project. I'm working on a memoir. I'm working on essays. I'm working on another poetry project. The anthology. I think it's taking less time now, but that was really for like yeah for the like before this year, more of like the last years leading up to like the past 4 years kind of time window, editing this global anthology of Palestinian writers for the past 4 years with Noor Hindi, who's like a sister to me, has been really meaningful. And just again, connecting with Palestinians across the world, like that was always the goal. I guess the question being like, why are we so disconnected from each other? Why is and it's a U.S. To be very very clear, it's a U.S. problem first and foremost. So many Palestinians around the world make so many attempts to like get in touch with Palestinians here, and it's like the reverse direction is like much less seen. And so how can we foster greater collaboration with our siblings in the homeland and in other countries and in other exilic contexts? And so Noor and I kind of went into it with this. It's always been this ulterior motive, like yes, it's an anthology or whatever, but like the more ulterior motive is like, hey, why don't we give each other like this concrete excuses and venues to like meet and co-conspire and be in greater connection and conversation? And so that is just beginning in a way, because the anthology comes out May of next year. And yeah, so we're kind of in the mindset of like, okay, here we're at the pivot point. We're going to be like, let's like create opportunities for us to gather. Let's make those spaces and let's collaborate with places like Mizna and Haymarket and Rowie, Radius of American Writers, and Manatma, and all these kind of SWANA centric spaces, and actually like get the fuck together, and um, and break bread and whatnot. So yeah, so it's been very it's my collaboration era for sure. And and again, like I don't see how catastrophe can produce anything else, for being a Palestinian. I don't know how to exist in the world and except to say something to make something in service of a collective.
I am similarly, I think, to where you ended, George, trying to focus on thinking about how what I make might be useful. And I think that's looked like a few things at the moment, given sort of the particular space that we find ourselves in right now. I'm trying to find opportunities to, uh, as you said, George, like funnel money to people in Gaza who need it. And so uh, thinking about what kinds of tools I have as an artist that could be useful for that. Offering workshops with the group Workshops for Gaza. I'm organizing a few like performance evenings here in DC that are intended to raise money and send money, and an art sale, and like, one of the things that's useful to me in a moment like this. I think a lot of artists kind of, especially as this began, this escalation in October, like kind of had a moment of crisis of thinking about how artistic skills could be of use to a kind of growing movement of resistance in the United States. And there's a lot of answers to that question. One thing that in this moment I'm sort of thinking about is one of my former mentors, Michael Road, has an idea of civic practice and performance, which really just is about thinking of artistic process in service of community or of collective struggle. So rather than thinking, well, how can I make a piece of art that is going to help, like whatever local chapter of the movement I want to be connected with, it's breaking down our skills as artists and saying, I don't think a piece of performance is necessarily going to be useful, But what I do know how to do as a performance artist is rehearse. I know how to connect people. I know how to schedule things, right? So trying to break down the component parts of our practices and see where those parts actually can be useful and fit. So sometimes that's a helpful thing, which also allows us to let go of this kind of individualistic artist model that is really prevalent within I think a lot of times, Western arts institutions and arts ecosystems, and to think about, artistic products not always being useful in a particular moment, right? Or by themselves not being enough. And I think that can often feel like a scary thing, but at the same time, it can feel like a generative thing too, right? To wonder how we can actually insist upon their usefulness by letting go of certain expectations we might have about what art making means. Um, so that's something that I'm trying to continue to hold and think with. And along with that, I've been thinking a lot about despair. Um, and in a variety of ways, I think. Number one, it's just an affective position that it has been kind of inescapable in this moment. And I think there's a kind of line that people often have that sort of despair is like counter-revolutionary. We can't allow ourselves to fall into despair. And I understand where that comes from, and also I'm not sure about it. I have found for myself the feeling of despair to be very clarifying, and to be like a space that it's important to honor and sit in and actually do the same kind of thing and wonder like how can this be useful. So in my own like performance work in thinking about what I'm working on right now, I think that's a space I'm really curious about, and in trying to sort of write a new solo performance towards that question in some ways. It's ending up being a similar kind of process to Eve, actually. I keep finding myself doing this actually in my projects, is like taking canonical texts and sort of like doing something different with them. I don't know why exactly. I'm sure I could like try and figure it out, but that's for a different podcast. So I've been spending a lot of time with the Book of Job, which is very meaningful to me and has like been a real container in terms of language and ideas for some of the things that I've been feeling and thinking about. And back to where I started in describing like performance as a real site of relationality. Like one of the things I've felt over the last 10 months is that I don't relate to anybody really in the same way or at all. And so there's this kind of like deep alienation from a social fabric that I'm thinking about and wondering how or if performance then exists within that feeling. And Job has been a useful vehicle to start trying to think about how to address that question. So those are some things I'm working on.
Wow. I really appreciate everything that you both just said, but also, Fargo, I felt like you hit on a few things that artists have been thinking about. I mean, that Nabra and I have specifically been talking about together is like, what do artists do now? And I really appreciated some of the things you said around acknowledging the despair that is happening here and figuring out like we can't ignore it. That's not an option, and it's not a good option, and it's not how we exist in community together without acknowledging our own feelings. But also that sometimes it's not about the artistic piece; it's about really figuring out how artists can contribute in other ways. And George, I see the agreement. I also love, just the support that you do have for each other, even like we can see in this podcast call, which is amazing. Um, George, I don't know if you wanted to add something to that.
I mean, no, it's just sometimes we need someone to do the like quote unquote unsexy work or whatever, or the invisible, like less visible, like less quote unquote heroic. Like there are no heroes. And like someone was just saying, like it was a tweet. I forgot who said it. Someone tweeted months ago, like we don't have heroes in this movement. We have collectives, like and heroism is the individualism seeping back in, right? It's just yeah. I mean, like that's the thing. Sometimes the best thing to do is like, okay, I am gonna like put aside my fucking ego and my like feeling. I'm gonna work through my feelings, not just like shut them out, including despair, which I'm interested in thinking more with you, Fargo, on. But and just be like, yeah, like okay, this is just what needs to be done, and I'm just gonna prioritize what needs to be done, and just that's I work at business. There's no avoiding that question of just like, yeah, someone needs to just get some of this like less interesting shit done because that's what we need to do to move on and do the work we do. But yeah, it's just interesting thinking about. I've been thinking a lot about yeah, this sort of um, artistic production can be seen in such a weird, like weirdly elevated light. I'm trying to think about how can we can like yeah, I love what Fargo was saying earlier about like deconstructing it to like no, actually like maybe my use right now is being like I am an editor, therefore I can I'm thinking about yeah sure a Ghazan poet who's our fellow at MENA who's been creating these incredible group chats where he just sends like to massive amounts of people like hey like that he's connected with here is a personal statement from someone in Gaza applying to like insert scholarship and insert country or whatever, or applying for this kind of thing. And it's a network of like people who are like poets, artists, academics, academia adjacent, etc. People who are like, okay, I'm gonna actually use my skills and just like go into this Google Doc and help this person get a scholarship, and just things like that. Sometimes that's like way more useful, right, than like I don't know, like someone's like self-portrait as mother under Gauze and Rubble poems that we get. Where I'm just like, this is like what? It's just yeah. I don't know. I'm also and Fargo will not be the one to say this, but like I really have returned a lot to that essay he wrote that was published in Protean, like in I think December. Notes on crafts and dismantling this apparatus of imperial capital C craft, and how can we actually get to a mode of uncrafted like making and being with each other is something I've been thinking about. And replacing at a process level, replacing craft with theory and like political theory and radical insurgent political theory more specifically as our guide to like what are we doing, and sometimes that just I don't know takes the mode of like I am not going to be art making and I'm going to be doing these menial tasks because that is much more useful right now. And guess what? Some of us might be making better art on the other end of it because we were able to stop and be like, hi, I'm going to actually be a human first, or I'm going to actually, be a member of a community first. And, I don't give a shit about these, like, that stupid book that just got announced of like the after Gaza, like someone, again, non Palestinian writing about like, and like, it's just illiteracy. It is just utter stupidity why people think books like this need to exist and go in and create, and quite frankly, no one except Palestinian civil society is, qualified to talk about the future of Palestinians, period. So I'm just kind of like, anyways, like, but all of which is to say, like, yeah, sometimes, especially in academia, I'm really like looking at y'all academics, like sometimes, no, humble yourselves, get off your fucking high horse, get into the Google Docs, get into the less sexy work. That is the most useful thing an academic can do. I think Salman Sharif had this quote in a Ms. interview actually about places of like with Tariq Jobs, where she's like, I know when to get out of the way, being in academia, and sometimes that is the most useful thing people in academia can do is just get the fuck out. And
Yeah.
Sorry for the soapbox.
No, it's a great soapbox. I mean, I think it's actually a great way to end our time together in this episode, because I feel, first of all, we'll link the notes on craft for anyone who's listening, but also looking at the transcripts, so people can find it. And I'm glad that you mentioned Yahya, because if people follow Yahya's Instagram, there are frequently like calls to action in small ways of like, if you are able to help with this, if you have time, like that's what working community is. And so I feel like there have been many actual like philosophical moments that have been in the past several minutes of this episode with you two. But I feel like one of the biggest overarching was that to work in a collective means to put yourself aside, to get out of the way, and to see what is needed to work in this current moment. And it's also about taking care of yourself too, and acknowledging your own feelings, but to work with the group. So thank you both so much for your time. I know that you're incredibly busy, and we just really are so grateful for you both being here. And we're looking forward to getting to engage with your work in different ways soon.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thanks to you both.
Thank you.
This podcast is produced as a contribution to HowlRound Theatre Commons. You can find more episodes of Kunafa and Shay and other HowlRound podcasts by searching HowlRound wherever you find podcasts. If you loved this podcast, please post a rating and write a review on your platform of choice. This helps other people find us. You can also find a transcript for this episode, along with a lot of other progressive and disruptive content on the HowlRound.com website. Have an idea for an exciting podcast, essay, or TV event the theater community needs to hear? Visit HowlRound.com and contribute your ideas to the Commons.
Yalla, bye.